Hello everybody, Dr. Alex Vasquez here, wishing you buenas noches. And what we're going to do right now is go through this article titled More Evidence Ultra-Processed Foods Are Detrimental for the Brain. This was published on the Pharma news site the other day on August 1st. Today is August 3rd of 2022. This was published on Medscape. I'm just going to use this as a conversation piece to talk about this concept and then a few other details. So basically what they did here is they took a food survey and then used some standardized tests of mental performance to see how diet correlated with mental performance. And not too much of a surprise, what they found here is that increased consumption of ultra-processed foods, so that's what usually we would call junk food, basically. And they made a list of that, so this would include soft drinks, chips, chocolate, candy, ice cream, sweetened breakfast cereals, packaged soups, chicken nuggets, hot dogs, and fries. In other words, the foods that many of us grew up on. So all of those cause systemic inflammation. They contribute to obesity and overweight, which then creates its own inflammation. And all of these can then contribute to brain inflammation, which impairs brain function. So as you can see, what I want to do right now is talk about some of the details, some of the mechanistic details. And we could talk about, like we could divide these into different categories. For example, which ones are reversible, which ones are not reversible, which ones are short-term and acute versus more long-term. So what I'm going to do right now is just write down a few of the mechanisms on the screen, as you'll be able to see, but I think I'm going to change colors real quick so it stands out just a little better. And let's get right to it. So what would be some of the mechanisms through which ultra-processed foods could harm the brain? Well, as I already said, inflammation. And we could divide that into body and brain. So when people eat inflammatory foods, like just junk foods, it could be like the typical fast food breakfast, for example, which was actually studied and proven to cause this effect. I think this was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, I believe in 2002. It might have been 2004, but certainly one of those 2 years. That's when we had our first evidence that, yes, a junk food diet, in this case they used a fast food breakfast. I believe it may have actually been from McDonald's, or they may not have said McDonald's, but it was hash browns and kind of the McBreakfast thing. What they showed there is that consumption of such a diet promoted acutely inflammation, specifically through activating NF-kappa B, which is kind of the key transcription factor for activating or transcribing pro-inflammatory pathways. So again, mechanisms here would include inflammation of the brain and the body. If you inflame the body, you're going to inflame the brain. I just made a few notes here. I'm going to look at that. Overall, over time, this would also promote atherosclerosis, and that would cause reduced blood flow to the brain. So that would be another mechanism. Another mechanism I'll put here, number 3, would be nutritional deficiencies. So processed food diets are notoriously deficient in nutrients. So here we could be talking about anything, but let's just say zinc and vitamin D and probably B12 and a whole list. You could put any nutrient. Any nutritional deficiency is going to impair brain function and kind of neuronal metabolism, and those things go hand in hand. Another note that I mentioned to myself very briefly when I was thinking about doing this, we would also expect a processed food diet to lead to dysbiosis, which would then lead to kind of an altered gut-brain axis, so to speak. So that's the popular term. We could just say dysbiosis. For me, that's sufficient. But some of the mechanisms there would be, for example, increase in propionate. So propionate is a short-chain fatty acid produced by gastrointestinal bacteria. And yes, it's normal to produce that, but you don't want too much of it because it is actually neurotoxic and associates, quote unquote, with certain neuropathologies such as autism, for example. So when people eat a junk food diet, they're going to make more of this bad short-chain fatty acids. So it's propionate. It seems to be neurotoxic according to the bulk of studies that I've looked at. And some other toxins from the gut could include H2S or hydrogen sulfide, and also just dysbiosis in general increases the production of LPS, also known as endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide, and that is specifically shown to cause brain inflammation. So those are some of the mechanisms. Let's see if I covered everything. Oh, yeah, well, here's the other thing. So of course they didn't talk about this in this particular article, but from my perspective, trying to look at things from several different dimensions or perspectives, the other thing that we know about ultra-processed foods is that they correlate with social status, so to speak. So people who are poor tend to eat more junk foods because it's available, they don't have time, or they don't have access to fresh foods. So part of what could be going on here, I'll just put number 5, is that we're looking at a social influence, and of course they try to control for it, but of course they can't control for it perfectly. So I'm just going to put social status. What I specifically mean there is money, time, access, and we could even put interest. Not everybody has interest in being optimally healthy. If they're miserable because of their low social status, maybe they just don't care what they eat. And you'll hear that a lot. I mean, you hear a lot of people say they don't care what they eat. So then the question becomes, well, why would they be so nihilistic, so to speak, about their own health? And I don't think humans are born that way. They're not born indifferent to their health, but we can make them indifferent to their health if we abuse them and make them kind of think and feel poorly of themselves. So maybe they just don't have interest. Sorry, my pen just quit working. Can we get some pen action, please? Interest. Maybe they just don't care. One of the things that goes with consuming an ultra-processed food diet is low social status, and that also correlates with something which is a term that I have a lot of interest in called social defeat stress. Social defeat stress, which actually causes brain inflammation. So what we could be looking at, I'm sure we are looking at this, is an interaction between kind of the social climate, which causes brain inflammation, and then adding on top of that a junk food diet that causes brain and body inflammation. Now, we could make this worse if we added some sleep deprivation. So let's add some sleep deprivation on top of that. I'll just put an arrow down and put sleep for low sleep. Not to mention the fact that these people don't get to take vacations or kind of recharge and regroup. The other thing is, too, if they're poor, so again, poverty goes along with eating more junk food just through the mechanisms that I mentioned. People don't have the money, they don't have the time, they don't have the access, or they don't have the interest. But the other thing that I was just about to add is that, the other thing that goes along with junk foods and low social status, of course, is lower education as well. So I guess we have to put that. I'll just put low EDU. But what I really want to say in that isn't, I don't want to make that specific to formal education. I want to make that into something more generalized, which we'll call a deprived environment. So I really think that's probably paying off detrimentally in terms of reducing neurocognitive power, so to speak, associated with a ultra-processed food diet. So that would go along with kind of not simply a junk food diet, but kind of a junk neighborhood where people don't have access to art, theater, peace of mind, tranquility, exercise, let alone a library, let alone kind of an invited author to your local bookstore who actually might tell you something that you've never heard before, let alone a bookstore. So, those are things that go along with an ultra-processed food diet. The other thing that I wanted to make sure we talk about is this. The other group of people who consumes this type of diet are doctors, because a lot of hospitals actually have a McDonald's or a junk food restaurant within the hospital. Believe me, I've seen it. When I was in medical school, one of the local hospitals where we did most of our training, actually had a McDonald's on the first floor. And the doctors would eat there, and the patients would eat there, and the patients' families would go down and get junk food for their family members, the patients who were actually in the hospital rooms, either before or after major surgery. Again, I'll just say it was in Texas, but I remember seeing patients get coronary bypass grafting, so it's just bypass surgery for their clogged arteries, and they would eat eggs, bacon, and pancakes the morning after their surgery. And obviously that's just horrible. So that's the other group. Kind of the other side of this is that we feed this same diet not simply to poor people, but also to doctors and medical students and, public school students. Public school diet is mostly junk, funded by the government. It's always, partially subsidized. People are supposed to feel grateful for it because at least they're getting some food. But it's garbage food that damages their brains and keeps that whole class of people poor. And then when they're poor and they underperform, people say, oh, well, you're just poor and stupid, I guess. But the system is what helps make them poor and stupid, and the system keeps them poor and stupid through this vicious cycle of poverty, junk food, brain damage, so to speak. It is a mild form of brain damage. So poverty, junk food, brain damage keeps people poor, eating more junk food because they want more stimulation typically. And that keeps them kind of trapped in the system. The last thing I'm going to mention, is that this pro-inflammatory, nutrient-deficient diet also stimulates viral replication, and viral replication correlates very strongly with early dementia and Alzheimer's disease in particular, namely through herpes simplex virus type 1. So that would be another mechanism. I guess I'll put this as number 6 here. That would be another mechanism. I'll just put viral activation, viral ACT, and I'll put HSV1 for herpes simplex virus type 1, because that is specifically and consistently correlated with early dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and almost certainly activated by this type of pro-inflammatory nutrient-deficient diet. So that's my quick take on this. I just read this, I guess, yesterday, and wanted to make a quick review of it, but add a few nuances that, of course, they didn't include in the original review. So thank you very much. This has been Dr. Vasquez. I will post this on the blog at healthythinking.substack.com, and I wish you all a great day and buenas noches.